Hello and welcome back to And Still We Rise. I'm your host, Cristine Seidel, and we are returning with the lovely Taylor Strong today. Welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you back. And today we're going to continue a conversation that you've probably been hearing in social media. We've had a couple of videos, but it is the chat about emotionally immature parents. And that's right, Oprah was not the first one. We've been talking about this for a hot minute as therapists. So to begin, we kind of want to talk about what an emotionally immature parent actually is.
Yeah. Okay. So much like Cristine said, this is very timely. This has been a big conversation. I feel like a lot of people are talking about this on social media. What is the emotionally immature parent? So we're talking about parents who really struggle to regulate their own emotions. Our parents who struggle to, be present for their kids and have the capacity and show up for them in a way that, really develops that kind of secure attachment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ultimately, when we look at kids, they come into this world really seeking attachment.
Absolutely.
And so their number one place for attachment is their parents, and you can kind of develop different attachment patterns through your parents' emotional availability. So how do emotionally immature parents kind of come about? Because I know some of our listeners or watchers who may have children might be like, oh my gosh, am I an emotionally immature parent?
Yeah.
So how does a parent kind of evolve into that place?
So typically, there's obviously different ways that this could come to be, but what we see a lot is parents who grew up that didn't have an emotional connection that was modeled for them in a way, or they experienced trauma or neglect, or they lived in a household where emotions really weren't allowed and nobody connected with them on that, right? We're talking about like intergenerational patterns oftentimes, right? Like we're not talking about, this just comes out of thin air, which is why I think and I think we're going to introduce this into the conversation is like this blaming factor, right? Like we're not talking about where does the blame lie? We're talking about identifying patterns that have been, passed through generation to generation and what is the capacity that some people have versus what they don't, and how does that show up in parenting?
Yeah. And I think that word capacity is so huge because as a therapist and a mother, like it would be immature to not assume that in some way, shape, or form we have not, done some type of harm to a relationship with our children by just not having the capacity in that moment. Maybe we're stressed or we're, overwhelmed, or we're, we've got 1,000 things on our mind. In that moment, we may not have had the emotional availability and may have hurt our kids' feelings or may not have, met them where they were at. So to have the maturity to recognize my actions, my availability may have hurt or harmed my child in some way, shape, or form is part of the nuances we have to hold as parents. This isn't about right or wrong, good or bad. And we're seeing so much of that on YouTube and on social media. So many parents being like, well, I guess I wasn't a good parent then. They're wanting to be in this certainty of if you have any complaints, then I must have been a bad parent. But that's not what we're saying. Emotional maturity is really about having the capacity to sit with other people and understand the nuances of relationships. And for some parents, for whatever reason, from their own childhood, and again, a lot of these parents were from generations where it's like children are to be seen and not heard. They themselves haven't had a chance or an opportunity to be witnessed from their own grievances of their parents or the parent-child relationship. So we understand that generationally this could be an issue, but this is not about passing blame and telling clients to go no contact. That actually doesn't happen in our therapy sessions, and we'll kind of get into that. But it really is recognizing that emotionally immature parent kind of label, and we don't like to use labels, but that this topic is really about the capacity to hold the nuance of the parent-child perspective versus the certainty of right or wrong, and being able to tolerate the conversation that a child or adult child may need to have with a parent.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something really important too about like the difference in capacity and just continuity of behavior, right? Like, because when we talk about capacity, it looks really different all the time. Like, you're a mom, I'm a mom. I know that sometimes my resources are high, right? Yeah. I am sleeping well. I'm, getting my exercise in, life is pretty good. I'm like in some form of homeostasis, right? When that does not happen, when my resources are not online, right? My capacity looks different and it reflects in my parenting, right?
Yeah.
And I wrote a blog, I believe it was probably like 6 months ago at this point.
We'll put a link to it.
Yeah, we'll put a link to the blog. But so this is like where we talk about repair, right? And like when we talk about capacity in a relationship with a parent who is fully emotionally disengaged or immature or whatever, however you want to say it, they lack the capacity to recognize that, okay, like I'm having a hard moment, right? And I may have engaged in parenting or acted or responded in a way that wasn't ideal and was emotionally immature, but I'm willing to engage in repair. I'm willing to say, hey, like that was not the way that I wanted to show up there. I'm sorry. I will do better. And that's that accountability piece, right? Where we acknowledge, hey, like I didn't exactly show up. And that takes emotional maturity, right? But that also takes being a parent who has the resources and the ability and the space to do those things, right?
Which I think is a great point to talk about capacity, because sometimes it is not just about like their own experiences. It could be about like, what is the dynamics of how many, children you're taking care of at any one time. And that's why I think a lot of siblings can have very different experiences in childhood, and why it's important to hold the sibling relationship in a different space than the parent-child relationship. But it can be a lot of things. It could be, them having to navigate, demands of working and being a parent and or taking care of aging parents. So capacity can shift and change, but is the maturity there to be able to hear somebody else's emotional experience?
That's huge. Like stepping outside of yourself and attending to someone else's emotional experience, right? Because we talk about intention versus impact, right? So we can intend to say or do something good all day long, but what is our impact? Like what actually happened there, and can we hold space for it?
Yeah. And I think that's such an important piece to notice. Like, I don't think there's really any parent out there that does not have some level of psychopathology that doesn't have good intentions, right? Like they genuinely did the best they could in the moment with what they had. And understand that it could have impacted children differently.
Right. Which I think brings that part of the conversation in, is like, what does that actually look like, right? Because I think you and I, we see adults, and, that is a conversation that comes in a lot, where it's like, I find myself saying oftentimes in session, you had this experience and it's valid, right? And there were things that you needed that you didn't get, right, from your parent.
Right.
And sort of deconstructing that can be really difficult, especially for a child of an emotionally immature parent, because you are so hardwired for that self-abandonment. Right?
Yeah. And just really, as a child, needing that attachment for survival. It's not like, we see it all the time with like a lot of, children that have been raised in an orphanage. It doesn't matter if there's somebody there to change their diaper, to make sure they have food. If there's not this emotional attachment and the basic fundamental ways, they don't survive. They end up having something called failure to thrive. And it's a real thing. Like, we're hardwired to seek attachment at whatever cost, because it really is about survival and safety. And so children are so primed to be conditioned to have a connection or an attachment regardless of the availability of the caregiver. So tell us what that kind of looks like, for kids of emotionally immature parents. Like, what starts developing? Again, we work with a lot of adults, so we do see this a lot of times in adulthood, in romantic partnerships, but also still in the dynamics of the parent-child relationship. And like Taylor was saying, like when we start validating their experience, it can sometimes be pretty mind-blowing, and they can really grapple with like feeling like they're doing something wrong by acknowledging that their parents,
it can feel really uncomfortable for them.
So what are some of the patterns you see?
Yeah, so I see a lot of just like, so with kids, I think they sort of develop this narrative, and I incorporate narrative therapy in my work, but it's like, I'm too much. I'm too much. There isn't space for me.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I need to make myself smaller in order to be loved. I need to just kind of go along because I feel safer, right? Yeah. And we talk about, and you touched on this, is like what feels safe to our nervous system, right? Is it becomes safe to live within that pattern of self-abandonment. It feels safer. And so oftentimes with my clients, like when we start identifying that pattern, right, and how they engage in relationships and romantic relationships, friendships, workplace, all of these things, all of these places that we find ourselves in relationship with people. And, we start doing this thing, which is essentially called fawning, right? And that's like people pleasing. And we are bending over backwards to kind of make everyone feel comfortable. We are abandoning our authentic self, right? And so when we start identifying that in session, it does feel really uncomfortable for people to for people to confront that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And to say, okay, like, this is how I've been showing up, and this is how I have been continuing to perpetuate this pattern. But, and what's interesting too, is like most of the time people are like, I don't even know how, I wouldn't even know how to connect back to self. And I can't even begin to tell you who my authentic self is.
Oh, 100%. Like that is like such a foreign language when adults come to therapy and therapists start beginning this processing with them. Is it's such a abstract way of connecting to self, because there was never really space to develop that in childhood. And likely if they've maintained a relationship with that parent, there hasn't been space for them to explore that within their own individual relationship with themselves or their parent. And relationships, like doing couples work, it's like, woo! Ooh, yeah, that'll be a place where stuff starts coming out.
Like that is where, when I'm like, all right, you know what? And oftentimes, and Cristine is a mentor to me, and she's been great. Like, this is where when couples come in, oftentimes it's like, we will need to really do some self-work before we really start engaging in the couples work. And it's not to say that this work won't be effective within your relationship, because you identifying patterns and how you show up within the relationship is just helpful therapy by osmosis, right? Like, and if both of you are doing it, all the better. But really, this is like where we start to see a mirror of our patterns.
Yeah. And I think fawning, especially in adulthood, I've gone through my own, work with my own family of how much I became what I was supposed to be, like just compliant with the family system in order to be accepted, in order to be, to belong. And that was a lot of just like really significant work that I had to do. But there's also like that freeze response too. And we see that a lot of times in couples work. I'll see couples where one of the partners is like, hey, like we need to identify and address something with, say, your mother or your father. And it is like unable to actually start addressing that. If there's this avoidance, like I sometimes call it the fainting goat, where it's like, I can't.
Conflict, right? Because if you are constantly in childhood met with a parent who cannot hold space for your emotions and or is overtly, combative.
Yeah, like there's a punishment if you have any. Yeah.
So your nervous system is automatically going to go into that freeze response where it's like, okay, in order to keep myself I will not engage in this. Yeah. And that is how I maintain safety. So that is how that will show up in a relationship.
Which is just, it's so interesting to watch it in real time, because especially in couples work, you have like a partner here who is fundamentally sitting with you on the couch, right? Yeah. And they're like, I want to work on this relationship, and we need to address these things with like your parent. And the other partner is like terrified of that, they're like, I don't know, and sometimes they start doing the fawning with the parent too, and trying to defend the parent. So it's such a complicated relationship when it's been able to be in the unconscious. Yes. When it's been something that we have just been on autopilot navigating life from. We tend to not know about it until somebody kind of becomes a mirror for us, or we start seeing these patterns in our own life that we're like, that fundamentally is not bringing about the relationships, the situations the regulation that I want within myself, and that's when we start exploring some of those early experiences with a parent and child. And emotionally immature parents, I think, is unfortunately a lot more common than a lot of people have believed it to be, because of the generational influence on parents being the authority and the child being subjected to whatever authority was in their environment. So I think it is a lot more common. But again, it's not something that as therapists we, drive a narrative of like, if there's any behaviors that look like an EIP, then you like totally cut them off.
Right.
So talk about like how to start working with that awareness that you may be an adult, child of an emotionally immature parent.
Yeah, I mean, I do love what you said too, just to touch on, because I think that's been part of the conversation lately, specifically is like, and I see often that I think there's like a reel going around, you're the worst person with their therapist, and it's sort of like this idea that people come into therapy and we're just validating everything, right? So but like the idea is for someone to come into therapy and for the therapist to really start deconstructing and sort of like understanding the person who's in therapy, their engagement in their own patterns, right? And we do it in this compassionate way, right? But it's like, I like to call it this compassionate accountability, right? Where I'm meeting you where you are in safety, and we're trying to understand together, what is the reality here of this relationship? What was this person's capacity, or what is this person's capacity that you're actively in a relationship with? And usually people don't come into therapy because they don't want a relationship with someone. They are coming because they want to work on a relationship or salvage a relationship. But it's like, when we start this work together, like as therapists, that is our job, right? To mirror you and to reflect back, and for you to be able to really understand all of those things. So within the process, I think what's really helpful for people is to just begin to identify those patterns. Because like you said, a lot of people come in and they're just like, I didn't realize that wasn't normal. I didn't realize that was,
that's not everybody got it.
That's not what other people's parents did. And I think like sort of helping the person to shift that blame, right? That like to come out of that, this is all my fault, because that seems to be a very common thread. It's like, well, if I was just different, or if I'm just nicer, or if I just overextend myself in this way, right? And we start talking about and having the conversations of, okay, well, what do you have the capacity for? What feels comfortable for you, right? And like, what does that look like while we're still working towards the objective of figuring out what roles we all play in this relationship?
Well, and I think that's such a huge piece, is like, awareness is not blame. Like, this is not, again, like, remember, relationships are in such a state of nuance, right? So it's like the duality has to coexist, right? Like, I have to be aware of what my emotional needs were and what level they were met at, and that my caregiver had the capacity that they had. Right. It is not like I had these emotional needs and you didn't meet them, right? So therefore no contact, you're evil, all the things. Because ultimately, like, really this journey is about understanding what our emotional needs. That's so much of adults coming in and parents bringing their children in. Like, what does my child need? What do I need? We have done such a poor job as a collective talking about emotional needs. We talk about mental health. But really fundamentally, it's at such a deeper level of what are our fundamental emotional needs in order to have a sense of regulation and safety in this world. And when we can come to that place and even just know what those potentially could be based upon developmentally where we're at, then we don't have to blame somebody. We can just acknowledge that was a place in my development that those needs were not met, which leads into why I might have these patterns. And, ultimately we would hope that repair could be done in a relationship, but that's not fundamental to the work. It's just something to explore, but ultimately we do have to come to a place of acceptance that if these are my emotional needs, what do I need to take responsibility for in this moment, at this point, in order to have them met appropriately within myself and within the relationships that I choose to have.
No, I think that that's a great point. And I think like just getting to that space is hard, right? Because I think even taking it back a little bit, like even I think when you have an emotionally immature parent, you operate from a place that it is more difficult sometimes to access emotions, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to really start verbalizing and feeling what it is that you're feeling. And I think that as clinicians, holding space in safety for people to really kind of explore what it is that they're feeling and allowing them and reminding them again, this isn't second nature for you. This isn't just this is something you've had to suppress. This is something that we don't just have unlimited access to because in order to keep ourselves safe, we had to basically push it away. So let's just allow space for that reality to be true, right? And I think that really resonates with a lot of people because they're like, you know what? That shifts that personal blame piece, right? And that brings in that self-compassion piece where it's like, okay, this makes sense that I show up this way. And I think even just that can be so helpful and healing for people.
I mean, and I think like what a sacred space to be as a clinician, to be able to be a part of that, because that in and of itself is a form of helping the client to reparent themselves. It's just like being an adult that can hold a space for somebody to have their own feelings and to actually be able to attune, because it does, like especially if there's been emotional neglect. The availability to tap into what do I need, what do I feel is so difficult that even just being able to hold space for a client to explore that is an act of compassion and an act of reparenting, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to do as a clinician, and a place where deep grief starts coming up.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. I think our last podcast was on grief, and grief isn't always just centered around a death, right? Like we grieve relationships and people, and the people that we wish they could be for us, or the version of them that could show up for us in a way that we need or feel connected. And that is real. That is absolutely real, and it's valid to grieve that, because I think that in this sacred work that we do with people, ignoring that is really doing people a disservice, because I think that is part of the pieces that have to come together, that there is grief and two things can be true at once, and many things in this scenario can be true at once, but we can hold space for the fact that it isn't fair that you weren't held emotionally, or you felt like you had to show up in a way that wasn't authentic to you, and that comes way later, right, a lot of times, but that isn't fair, and that you do feel a sense of grief with that.
And I think that that's something that's so complicated about attachment work, is like no matter how much we process through some of this unconscious conditioning that we have developed into adulthood, like there is this deep longing for a connection and belonging to our biological parents. I mean, even working with children of adoption that have these beautiful, loving families that would choose them 1,000 times over. There's oftentimes this core wound around that, and so that attachment is such a powerful thing, and I think the grief comes in so many different seasons that it's kind of like that complicated grief. There's not one single way to grieve through kind of the loss of the parent you needed, the loss of the parent you desire to be loved really by, and sometimes even the you feel like you would have been. You're still you, right? Like she's in there, she's definitely in there. But like grieving, the you wanted to develop into, and the path that you wanted to have, like that is another layer of the grief that sometimes shows up. And a lot of clients who get stuck a little bit in this work tends to be in that awareness, like when they start seeing things for what they are, they want so desperately for that parent to change. Right. They're like, well, if I just say this, or if I, can I bring them to therapy with me? And I'm like, girl, we shall see. We shall see. But I think that that there's a place that once you kind of see this for what it is, people will go into that blame.
Yeah.
But the grief really is where like the space has to occur so that you know how to come to a place within yourself and then in what direction to move. Because sometimes that awareness can be a place of blame and we cycle in this, like, but I want them to do this, but I want them to do that. Why won't they do this? We can get very stuck in the patterns of injustice that we had in childhood.
Absolutely. And I do hear that a lot. I hear that a lot, like how different my life would be if this wasn't my experience. And the reality is again, that's true. It's valid. I think it's important to acknowledge and validate that could be, and in some cases it might not be true.
Yeah.
But regardless, it is a authentic, valid thought and feeling that you're having. And I think just, looking at those feelings and allowing space for them again is super helpful for a lot of people. And I think, just reminding people that they're not to blame for their experience, right? And sort of shifting them out of that can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I think reframing is really good work, especially as clinicians working with especially adults in this space, is reframing and sometimes doing a little reparenting with them. And sometimes I get a little woo-woo with it, and I'm like, I've learned in my own experience, like my core wound, and attachment has led me on this journey to do the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. And
so sometimes it helps to be in that container of safety, to be a reflection of like purpose and goodness and like the wisdom and learning, and the way that they can understand themselves leads them to understand others.
Absolutely, them being so adaptive, right? Like, I mean, we touched on that too, but just this was your nervous system's way of protecting yourself. That's brilliant, right? Like, that is you showing up in a way that keeps you protected within that relationship. And although it was a lived experience and a part of you that you might change and is something that you have to work through, I think focusing on some of these micro bits of positivity that come out of that experience can be really helpful, right? And I think it takes, again, it takes some time to get there. I think we need to allow space for everything that exists with that. But in parallel with that, I think having some space for the good things that your body and your nervous system did in order to protect yourself can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, adults who kind of begin to do this naturally, even before they come to do therapeutic work, are oftentimes like, I am thankful that like what I've learned, like I've been able to shift that in my own parenting, and so that is something that, when we are in that healing cycle, that we can find those little micro bits of positivity to be like, well, wait a minute, like, I am still moving in my greatest good. Like, I'm still, a person of love and of light, and I can use this for something better.
Yeah.
So what about the people who are like, should I go no contact with my parents? So how do you start working with clients who are trying to navigate what to do, what action to take from the place of recognizing their relationship with their parent?
Yeah. No, I mean, like, I do see a lot of people who have complicated family systems, right? And there's these really kind of complicated dynamics. And, first and foremost, if someone were to come to me and say, I'm looking to go no contact, right? Like, that's a conversation that they're bringing into, the process. And that's fine. Like, I am absolutely open and willing to have that conversation, but not a conversation that I would just introduce on my own, right? Most people are not at the point where they come in and are saying they completely want to go no contact. It's not to say that it doesn't happen. But I think we ultimately just begin with, where are you? Where are you in this? And, essentially what right now, as we sit, do you have the capacity for? Because we can, start having conversations again around access, right? What level of access do you have the capacity to allow for this person or this relationship in your life right now? Because it might not look like what it looked like 5 years ago or even a year ago, because there are, you know, components of that don't feel safe, or they might be overextending you in a way that is not helpful, right? So it's like we start introducing this conversation of access, and I think that can be really helpful for people, because I think it's really empowering.
It is, yeah.
I think it's like, you know, okay, actually, I have the ability to say, and I think, you know, wasn't included in this, but like, I do think that there's this component of the emotionally immature parent and the lack of power that you have,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
Like you just have to kind of placate to their emotions and their experience and all of those things, and no matter what their, you know, intentions were, you know, you just have to sort of deal with the impact, right? And just kind of the unfairness of it. And I think it can be really helpful to talk to clients about, okay, well, you know, you do have some agency here. You can, you know, decide what you're willing to give, and it, you know, if going fully no contact feels really scary or not something that you want to do right now, we don't have to do that. There are different ways that we can approach this.
Well, and I love, you know, like it goes back to the nervous system, right? Like what is going on within your nervous system when you are activated in a state of like, I gotta go no contact, right? Because is this the, you know, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response that you're trying to navigate? You know, and sometimes we do have to go no contact. Sometimes we have to recognize, like, if there is something exceptionally harmful that's coming towards us, that we don't have the defenses for ourselves for, like, we do have to protect ourselves.
Absolutely.
You know? Whether it's a romantic relationship, a parent-child relationship, friendship, sometimes if our nervous system is like, danger, then going no contact is what we have to do for a period of time. But ultimately, empowerment comes when you can be regulated within your nervous system, and you know, boundaries come from us valuing ourselves and holding ourselves to the standards that we value, and that naturally creates boundaries. You know, I think ultimately when we do the healing work, we really don't need to block or go no contact with people, because we genuinely just don't entertain relationships that don't meet us to where we're at, meet us at the standards that we hold for ourselves. And it's kind of becomes this way of just navigating relationships that are aligned for you, versus no contact as a form of punishment, which again, that kind of goes back to that whole, like, when we felt powerless, we're seeking ways to be empowered, but is it from a lens of trying to punish your parent? Or is it because you genuinely learned what it is that you value in the relationship, and you're holding that parent to that standard?
And as you learn that, right, like really developing that sense of self-trust. And that's what a huge part of the conversation that we have is, like, how do we learn how to trust ourselves, right, and our experiences? And I think part of that does come from the work that happens of identifying the patterns, right? Like you are your experiences are valid, right? Like we can sit and hold space that this was a real lived experience that you had. Like, you're not just making this up out of thin air. And I think that is where people are able to kind of start leaning into that, okay, wait a minute, okay, I can trust myself. I can trust my judgment, I can trust my experiences. So when I start engaging in setting these boundaries, right, I can do it from a place that feels more grounded and authentic to me.
Because if you are the one that has begun doing this work, that has found that space of self-trust, and let's say a parent, emotionally immature parent, has not, even though they may want to, they probably are not going to meet you in the most grounded, regulated way. They're going to have a hard time receiving some of that, you know, information from you if you choose to pursue, you know, some type of reparative relationship with them. But again, that goes to availability. You know, when you've done this work, what are you available to make yourself vulnerable in, and what is the parent's availability to meet you there? And you know, to be a child is very invalidating to begin with. Right? Like, we don't really support children being children necessarily in our society. So it's already invalidating to step out there and to be, you know, to be expected to navigate an adult world. So there is this work around validating yourself and your experiences to build that self-trust, to be able to be regulated and grounded in those conversations. And if the person that you need to have some relational repair with doesn't have that availability, it is not appropriate to go there and make yourself vulnerable in that way, no matter how much you may genuinely want to.
Right, and that's when you said, like, you know, when someone's like, bring them in here and let's have, it's like, yeah, that would be great, but we, this is like an important factor that we kind of have to explore before that happens, because that will end up feeling really unsafe and not be productive. You, what you're seeking to get out of that is not something that they have the capacity for, right?
Yeah, and as clinicians, like, it's always important to make sure that we are kind of like being protective of the work that has been done, because that is, you know, again, acting as a frame for this reparenting, like, that is oftentimes something we needed in childhood, was an adult to be like, this is not safe, this is not appropriate, and so let's wait, or let's be a little bit more curious as to what it is that we're trying to explore, this, that, and the other. So I think that, like, seeking repair with an emotionally immature parent is not always the end goal. It's really more to know, like, what is the emotional need or needs that I have that were unmet that I can be responsible for now, and then if or when my parent is available for that, how can I be safe enough to seek that repair and relational, you know, restoration. And that also mirrors, like, you know, in romantic relationships too, or friendships, like, knowing that about yourself, healing some of those wounds through that parent-child relationship really sets you up for healthier relationships in general.
No, I think that's absolutely 100% true.
Awesome. Well, anything else you think we should share about emotionally immature parents?
I feel like we hit it. I mean, a lot of it, but I mean, I think, like, it can be a really arduous, difficult process to engage in. It can be really, really difficult for people to come in here and really confront that. And again, confront something knowing that you may not be able to get that external validation, that the real deep work comes from self, within the self, right? So I think knowing that going into it can be really helpful for people that, you know, just take that externalization piece out of it, because there is so much of that with this and the emotionally immature parent. And knowing that, you know, a lot of this starts with that really deep self-awareness and self-work that's going to have to occur within the relationship. And
I think that, like, being patient with yourself through the process, you know, it's something that we often needed in childhood and didn't receive it. But just knowing that, you know, you know, as clinicians, we've been doing this work for years, and, you know, it's beautiful work, regardless of what the end result is with your biological parent or your caregiver. It is ultimately about, you know, healing through that within yourself. And as much as it may be a trendy topic, it really is worth, you know, investing in that work. And I know you mentioned, like, I've talked about Lindsay Gibson's book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, but do you have a book that you think would be a good...
So one of my favorite books is Are You Mad at Me? Meg Josephine, she's an LCSW. She writes a book just essentially about the fawning response and, you know, how that kind of comes to be, that self-abandonment piece that occurs in childhood. What does that look like? She goes through, she beautifully kind of illustrates a couple of vignettes that, you know, I think most people who have this sort of lived experience sort of can just identify themselves in some piece of it, right? And I have recommended it to multiple clients, and, you know, the feedback I get is like, I've never felt more seen. And I'm like, well, that's the idea, right?
Exactly.
So it's Are You Mad at Me? And it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough.
That's great. We'll put a link to that book as well as link some of Taylor's other conversations with us. And of course, you can be looking forward to her being back on the show in the not too distant future. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom today. And we'll see you guys next time.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. Bye.